Hey, this is just a quick note about our sponsor, Privado, the premier enterprise privacy platform, purpose-built to bridge the gap between privacy and engineering. Its privacy code scanning solution embeds privacy, compliance, and governance into the product development lifecycle and empowers privacy and security teams with unparalleled visibility of sensitive data flows and the insights to find and fix privacy vulnerabilities. You can leverage Privado's data flows, dynamic data mapping, privacy assessment automation, and real-time visibility of privacy issues. Enter the era of proactive privacy and transform privacy from business blocker to business enabler. To learn more, go to privado.ai.
Are we using biometrics? Is that the right thing for entry? I mentioned that one before. If you're an employee, what if you don't want to use you don't want your employer to have such a detailed set of data around your facial makeup? Should they be forced to provide you a different mechanism to enter into their building? Or does experience kind of trump that? These are the types of things that we do, is keep on top of what's coming out and then provide some guidance off the back of that on how that could be achieved in a more ethical way.
Hello, I am Deborah J. Farber. Welcome to the Shifting Privacy Left podcast, where we talk about embedding privacy by design and default into the engineering function to prevent privacy harms to humans and to prevent dystopia. Each week, we'll bring you unique discussions with global privacy technologists and innovators working at the bleeding edge of privacy research and emerging technologies, standards, business models, and ecosystems. Welcome, everyone, to Shifting Privacy Left. I'm your host and resident privacy guru, Deborah J. Farber. Today, I'm delighted to welcome my next two guests, Luke Beckley and Yusra Ahmed. Luke is the Data Protection Officer and Privacy and Governance Manager at Correla, a company that processes gas consumption data across UK consumer market on behalf of gas suppliers. For over 25 years, Luke has helped organizations understand their data, to enable the data they process to work for them, and more recently, to enable that data with great governance and compliance with the prevailing data protection laws. He's also the Chief Compliance Officer for Hope For, a charity based in Moldova that helps victims of human trafficking. And he's worked as a data privacy consultant to the East London Business Alliance, which helps social enterprises and small charities with their data privacy obligations. Yusra Ahmed is the CEO of Acuity Data, which specializes in delivering sustainable change by leveraging the full potential of data, analytics, and decision-making across an organization's entire operations. With a proven track record of supporting a range of FTSE 500 clients to realize their strategic objectives through the use of data, Yusra believes that ethical data management is key to every organization's survival in this digital age. So Luke and Yusra have been working with the Real Estate Data Foundation, and combined, that's known, like if you condense that, that's known as the RED Foundation. Not to be confused with the AIDS Foundation that goes by the same name that like Bono is connected to. But so let's just, separate those two ideas right here. And then the RED Foundation, they shift that conversation left and ensure the data points generated by 9.84 million people on a daily basis is done so with privacy and transparency at the center. The RED Foundation is a sector-wide alliance that enables the real estate folks to benefit from data. Yusra currently serves as the chair of the RED Foundation's Data Ethics Steering Group, and Luke serves as the chair of the foundation's Engagement and Awareness Group. So you could see why we have both of them on the call today. Welcome, Luke and Yusra.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you very much for inviting us on. And as you've already mentioned, I am one of your super fans, so it's a privilege to be here. Thanks.
Yes, I have to admit, Luke is definitely one of my super fans. It's one of the ways I've gotten to know him is through conversations on LinkedIn. And it's not just because he's a super fan that I invited him on. He's got plenty to talk to us about in his field of expertise. That's how we connected, is through just a lot of engagement on LinkedIn. I guess we'll just dive in. So it appears that the real estate industry is seeking to leverage a lot of personal data at scale. And it feels like we're entering a perfect storm where the scope, the sophistication, and connectivity of data is increasing exponentially. So while this may bring advantages for real estate, obviously has a lot of new challenges. So could you share with us some of the current drivers for this change?
So, Deborah, thank you so much for inviting me on your podcast as well. So I'm really excited about having this conversation with you and Luke. So I've worked within the real estate industry for coming up to about 20 years now.
Wow.
Yeah, it's getting there, right? I probably shouldn't mention those numbers anymore. When it relates to the drivers for change, I mean, certainly I started off in this industry working on space and occupancy management. And so data for me has always been an integral part of the way that you do business in real estate and any organization, right? When we talk about the drivers for change, I think there has been a slight step change recently. And a lot of that has been driven through technology disruption ultimately. And this increasing desire to digitize the way that everything functions, in particular in real estate. But there's a number of other things I think that have been going on in the background. One of them, from our perspective, is ESG. Now, Luke and I have been working on a number of different things outside of Red Foundation as well. But what we're also seeing is that as organizations become much more focused on driving their diversity and inclusion agenda, their environmental impact agendas, etc., there's a heavier reliance on data. Not only because regulation, especially here in Europe, is demanding, but also just from a social responsibility perspective, you need to understand what your status quo is before you can make that change. And what we're increasingly finding is that some of that data is missing, and it's missing because it's not captured, or it's not captured in the right way or the right structure. And within that, there is an element of sensitive data. So whether that's PII or whether that is data that can somehow be linked back in order to identify a particular organization, or a particular organization deems it to be sensitive. So this kind of issue around trust emerges as a result of ESG. Going beyond that, I think there's additionally, we talk about this concept of workplace experience quite a lot. And it's been something that I've certainly heard about over the past decade, at the very least. It's a move towards agile working. It's a move towards more flexible working environments. But it's also impacted by the change in the workforce dynamics. And by that, I mean the younger generation coming into the workforce, having a completely different set of needs than we certainly have been trained to accept, I suppose, in the more traditional or conventional way. But also things like COVID and the lockdowns, that's also changed what the opinions or the attitudes of people who may have traditionally accepted the need to be in the office 9 to 5, 5 days a week, or sometimes 7 days a week, because I've met those people as well. So all of that, in order to become more efficient and to create this workplace experience, again, that is a very data intensive type of activity and type of service, which also relies on sensitive personal, potentially, information, with the rise of sensors in order to track occupancy and that type of stuff. The next I would mention, and I'm going to leave it there for now, but there are many more drivers, is something that I'm incredibly interested in, which is smart city development. And ultimately, that means the digitization of real estate as a whole. Whenever I say smart cities, I get a bit scared that people think of it as, some sort of Jetsons episode. But that's not what I mean.
Oh, be careful. This might be the name of the episode now.
Well, there is a temptation to think of it in those terms, but the reality is that most capital cities, most metropolises across the world are already smart cities. And again, in order for you to provide that digital experience, for you to be able to navigate across a city in the way that we have become used to through an app, through your phone, whatever it is, that requires data, right? And that requires digitization of a particular asset. And so as our built environment becomes increasingly more advanced and more digitized, again, this is the rise of data and the need for data. And I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but this then kind of kicks in this concept of how do you ensure that you are managing this data in the most ethical way possible? And a lot of that is really not just to do the right thing, but so that people you're collecting data about, who are the people you're delivering services to, trust you with that information so that there is this unspoken trade-off. You give me the service and I give you the data that you require. But there's a gentle person's agreement that you're going to do the right thing by me and make sure I'm protected. There's a few thoughts for you.
Yeah, that is really helpful for contextualizing the state of the industry and kind of like what's changing, why we're even having this conversation today, right? Luke, do you have anything to add to that?
I don't think there's very much more to add to that. I think that's very comprehensive. I think that there's almost an awakening that's happening in the real estate industry. They've been collecting data points, and we'll get on some of those shortly about what data has been collected for many, many years, but not in any way in kind of using that data to drive the best use of their assets. And I think this is, and Yusra has touched on it, this is one of the things that her and I converse on very, very frequently. How do we bring all of the obligations, the compliance elements, the privacy elements together with the actual volume and different data points being captured in a way that actually allows those developers and those assets to be utilized in the best way possible? And I think a lot of that, as Yusra has mentioned, is the driver that kicked off through the unfortunate circumstances of COVID. So people's return to work suddenly made them realize how they wanted their spaces to work for them. And so there's a whole heap of social proof and pressure building, as well as a kind of an awakening and awareness of all the different data points that have been captured and how that can converge with that social proof and now new need for better spaces and better use of spaces in a environmental way and for the benefit of the individuals using those spaces. It's a really interesting and dynamic and great place to be kind of at what we feel is at the start of that awakening process.
I would also add to that, I think there's an element of play that within the industry as well. And I'm not sure if you would agree with me, Luke, but there's this sense of as well as there's new technology coming out, real estate, not only operators, but occupiers want that for themselves. And I certainly have been through a few rounds where, when AI came out, when big data came out as concepts, straight away everyone was like, well, let's use that. And it's almost as though the industry is trying to grapple with these technologies and then thinking about the use cases afterwards rather than the use case ahead of time and then what works for us, which is a completely different challenge that I end up having to do.
Yeah, and I 100% agree with that, though. I do. That has always been the case.
That's fascinating. Oh, God, I have so many questions, but I want to make sure we actually stay on a track, too. What comes up are questions around ethics and motivations, and real estate is just generally has been such a market where it's worth whatever someone's willing to pay for it, right? So it's like I wonder how much revenue is, like any business in corporate America, is going to be driving the use of these technologies before they're ready. Like you said, if they're asking you to think of the use cases later, but let's start playing with the technologies, then it almost feels like a lot of that would be almost experimenting on people in real time to see what works, which is not recommended for ethical tech innovation and deployments. But before we even get that far, my brain is going off in different directions based on what you just brought up. Let's talk about what types of personal data real estate companies are collecting and using or want to collect and use in the future, and for what purposes.
The answer is a vast array of data is being collected, and possibly some things that individuals using the spaces and or the companies themselves don't necessarily consider personal data or think about. So, you range from people's access into buildings. You go through, as was already mentioned, the capture of data through the various sensors that try and help drive the smartness of the building. You've obviously got CCTV and surveillance cameras UK is one of the most surveilled.
I was just going to say, yeah, obviously we're talking about
in the world. And so, I know that, there are big real estate companies with private public spaces that have got large CCTV operations in place. And then you've got the actual individual records of the people who are in the building. You've got things, medical records back to special category data. For example, a lovely thing called PEEPs, which is personal emergency evacuation plans. They need to be held by landlords and all the occupiers, because obviously if you have people with a specific set of needs in an emergency situation, you need the facilities team to be able to understand what those needs are and react in a way that enables you to get that individual out of the building quickly. But that's special category data. And inherently, real estate organizations have been quite bad from a privacy perspective about how that is captured, stored, and secured. And so the array of data is just enormous and ever-changing. Yusra's already touched on it. The sharing of that data then becomes an even more complex requirement. So, for example, when you're trying to do energy efficiency, for example, and you want to look at occupiers and landlords, suddenly you're into a access control sharing of data. That brings this whole plethora of additional complexities that we'll touch on later. I mean, that's just a kind of a brief-ish overview, but as you can imagine, that's just those sets of data are quite voluminous in their own right.
Yeah. In fact, also what comes to mind is exact location data. I know many retail establishments, for instance, make use of location data for analytics purposes, like how many people came through. I don't need to necessarily identify them, but like how many people, like humans, let's identify that that's a human, and how many came into the store on which days, so that we can, I don't know, better staff our store on those days, or, for whatever inputs or whatever analytics purposes that they have. But how are retail establishments putting protections around that location data, if at all?
I think the answer is badly. And I think back to the point about use case testing is possibly fairly valid. So you're right. What happens is Wi-Fi installations in stores, for example, or in retail assets, potentially have the ability to track individuals around that as they're pinging the individual access points. If you sign up to that Wi-Fi, you're effectively allowing them access to your location data for them to track you around the store. And again, something Yusra and I touched on and talked about last week was walking past individual stores who have also had that data shared with them. So they're enabled in a manner to present you with I'm walking past X retail store, and here I popped up and said I get X points on my loyalty card, right? So I think there's a wide use of that and a drive towards using that for the analytics purposes you've mentioned. But I think there is complexity, both from a transparency perspective about exactly how that data gets used, that is not necessarily being grasped that well. So I think there's a lot more work that can be done around really explaining how geolocation and or just Wi-Fi location pings are being used and can be used. Yes, I get it. Ethically, you're trying to, the companies are providing the best experience for the consumer, but that's not necessarily translating into the transparency about that data being used and for whom it's being shared with to drive that experience and whether the consumer even wants it. There is a whole heap of work to do.
But you get points. You get 10% off your toothpaste for giving up your privacy.
Deborah, we can go into this offline. I can assure you it is much more scary than you think.
Oh, no, I can assure you I know how scary it is.
I'm sure you know.
So the argument here is, are the privacy notices insufficient, or are you saying they're sufficient, but nobody looks at them and it's not part of the consumer experience or to drive them to look at it or in the awareness about how their data might be used and secured and maybe shared anonymously, or is it shared direct identifiers? Like, where is is it the practice that we want to change? Is it that we just want to make it clearer, or are they really just not even embedding the requirement appropriately into, whether it's the Wi-Fi's notice?
I think it's really a combination of all of those, but predominantly the first two you mentioned, which is one, the complexity of privacy notices, especially here in Europe and the UK, plain, simple, straightforward language is meant to be used. But what you also find or tend to find quite often is very complex and very long privacy notices with not necessarily very user-friendly language used to actually detail exactly what's happening to that data. And then second thing is, and I think we'll touch on this a bit further into the conversation, is the education and awareness from a consumer level about being able to really understand and read those privacy notices, even if they're in plain language, to understand what the potential impacts of that data sharing really is. So there's an education piece that needs to be done, but I think there is also a cleaning up of transparency piece definitely required.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hello, loyal listeners. The Shifting Privacy Left podcast is seeking sponsors who want to help educate our growing community of privacy engineers. Position your brand in front of privacy engineers, architects, developers, researchers, and privacy tech buyers. Insert a 30 to 60 second ad like this one into every published episode of the podcast. This is dynamic content after all. Feature your new product, an upcoming conference, a sponsored special deal, endless opportunities. Email sponsorship@shiftingprivacyleft.com for more information on our sponsorship package. Okay, let's get back to our engaging privacy conversation.
I think if I can just jump in, I think we're in a way a little bit lucky though within the UK and across Europe, because we do have the benefit of GDPR. Whatever some people might think about it, at least it's a starting point in terms of providing some guardrails in terms of how organizations behave. And I'll do a little plug for Red Foundation here, because right at the start of our Red Foundation venture on the ethics committee, we wrote a piece around specifically consent, which is what the heart of this conversation. And I guess the challenge is that whereas part of GDPR states that consent must be explicitly given by the data provider to the essentially the processor, etc. The reality is that how can you consent if you don't know what you read, or if you've just flicked through it in order to get to the bottom? And this is no comment on anyone, because I've done that many a time myself. I just give me the Wi-Fi, I'll sign anything. But the reality is that would you even understand it if you read it, if you're reading hundreds and hundreds of pages? However, what I would say is that the situation is getting better, because there is increasing onus on organizations to simplify the messaging and to articulate the key points of these long-winded, historically complex documents, so that we make things easier for individuals before they click sign. I mean, at the end of the day, though, if you're holding them hostage, and I'm not going to say where, but I've definitely been in one of these massive shopping malls where you lose signal to your telephone, and the only way to be able to communicate with the world is to sign up to their Wi-Fi. Some of that, that's where ethics come into play. Is that really appropriate? And is that really fair, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I mean, I don't think it's fair. Just a personal anecdote here. Anecdote. I feel like I slurred that to say anecdote, but anecdote. I was actually a subcontractor on the Target breach, set of consultants that came in to kind of assess the current state, what the future state should be, recommend, changes. And so for weeks, I was flying to Minneapolis to help Target at headquarters with a Target team of other folks. And one of the things that we did was just start cataloging all of the potential areas of data collection. And one of those things was the brand new Target Wi-Fi agreement. And you're, saying that you would be gladly tracked, or well, not gladly, in exchange for Wi-Fi, you'd have this experience, and then they'll be tracking around the store and all that, where it was just like, who would ever think, especially this was years ago. So it's like, I don't know, close to a decade ago at this point, maybe 9 years. Who would ever think that in signing up for Wi-Fi in a shopping experience, that would mean that you've consented to have all of your movement tracked as you're going around the store, which is exactly what you're saying has now been propagated across other buying experiences. And I just don't think that your everyday person, if you ask them on the street, has any idea that this is going on, even if they did consent to whatever the disclosure language was when being prompted for Wi-Fi. And so, yeah, I think there is definitely a transparency issue. And it's kind of crazy that 9 years ago, this was my experience as it was just coming to market. I feel like at that time, Target was avant-garde in the space of leveraging that kind of tracking technology compared to a lot of other retailers in the space. I'm wondering also, is it only constrained to retailers, or are there other real estate deployments of tracking technology? So I'm thinking giant convention centers. And when you have 100,000 person conference or 20,000 person conference, like, are there people being tracked? Or are you agreeing to Wi-Fi and being tracked on your physical location movements throughout that experience? But then I think about something like where you're told you're being tracked, but it's not for purpose, and you're told that what the purposes are and when they end. Something like when I worked for Amazon and I went to their Amazon Go store, where you literally walk in the store, there are no checkout lanes. They just recognize you're a person and what this person's doing the whole time. And then when you check out, it knows what's in because there's sensors on the ceiling and all that, and that's tracking, and it knows where you are, what you bought or what you're taking out of the store with you, and it just charges your account. And it's like a seamless experience. And the line, theoretically the lines there aren't really lines, right? So I've seen something like that where you are aware going in, the whole concept is you're being tracked through the store, but then when you leave, the question is what information is still being retained and how's that being used, and is it being shared, is still there. But at least there's an awareness, because the entire point is that you do everything by yourself. It's like there's nobody checking you out, right? So anyway, what I'd like to talk about is the Red Foundation. Assuming most of my audience, like myself, has not that much awareness into the real estate industry and how they're dealing with these issues overall. So what data protection, privacy, and ethical challenges does the foundation seek to solve for today? And then how are you approaching those issues?
Well, if I can jump in, maybe I'll take a step back and talk a little bit about what the Red Foundation was set up to do. So the Red Foundation, the initial premise was to create a platform within the real estate industry, focusing initially within the UK, because the founder of the foundation was based here, frankly. So that's why it started here. But it's to create a platform whereby we can come and discuss data-related issues. And so the foundation is broken down into 4 different committees, an overarching committee, and then 3 subcommittees. One, which is populated by a number of different universities within the UK. Another, which is all focused on data standards. As we know, without data standards, we really struggle to structure, manage, produce quality data. And that's a significant challenge for us within real estate. I'll talk about that another time, but my biggest challenge was the fact that individual data sets aren't structured to be integrated with each other. So it makes life very difficult when you're trying to report against the whole life cycle. And then the final committee, which I've only just recently taken over as chair, I will add, is the ethics committee. Now, as part of that, we have got, I think it's about 6 different ethics principles, which we are advising organizations to sign up to. So these are accountable, transparent, proportionate, confidential and private, lawful and secure principles around managing your data. So it's all very simple. It's all aligned with GDPR guidance as well, and other guidance that's come out through legislation here in the UK and Europe. And what I would also say is that this is a pan real estate platform. So everyone that's joined is doing it gratis. So we are, volunteering to be a part of this, and we are representing, or we joined at the very least to represent a wide subset of the industry. So we have software providers, real estate consultancies, developers, occupiers, lawyers, academics. So it's a significant, subsection of the industry that's being represented. So there's, I think, approximately about 60 of us in total. And it's growing. And we are welcoming more organizations that want to be part of the conversation. So within the ethics piece, and what we've essentially been doing is to try to work out how we can ensure or provide guidance to the industry on what ethical data management actually means. And to your question, Deborah, is what are these blind spots that we have? Now, my background has been predominantly within the occupier space. And so immediately, I think my inclination would be, well, actually, within real estate, we capture very, very little personal information, and that's very specific. But the truth is that that's inaccurate. And Luke already talked about, like, wrote that off right at the outset. But I think what we're actually trying to say is that there's no one we don't believe that anyone in the real estate industry is doing anything unethical. But what we're trying to propose is that we are mindful in terms of the way that we approach data management. And that means that ultimately, kind of distilling it down into one sentence is making sure that you're always capturing as much as you need and no more, and only for the time period that you need it. Ultimately, that's the core of it. But I think what tends to happen is, we touched on it a little bit at the start, is this excitement about possibility without a use case. And so the amount of times I've heard, well, why don't we just grab a bunch of really smart data scientists, get them in a room, throw some data at them and see what comes out? Well, no. No, please don't. That's not the best or most efficient or even actually most ethical, if you like, way to go about it ultimately, because what you should do is you should have a very specific reason for capturing some of this data and a very specific viewpoint on what you want to do with it, and then use it for that particular purpose. And if you need it for something else, especially if you're capturing personal information, then you need to go back and reconfirm the consent for you to use that data in the way that you propose to use it. So beyond that, what I would also add is that it's really important to drive home this viewpoint that as real estate becomes more digital, as we start to ask more things of our technology, our need is going to change. So one of the things that I've been hearing about, I'm not sure how many people have actually started incorporating this into their assets, but the ability to use biometric entrance into a particular building. So just as you would open your iPhone with your Face ID, you'll be able to walk into your office with that same face without having a badge as you historically would do. And that means that you're giving away more of your data. And there's implications with that, right? Because ultimately, if you're going to be putting demands on your employees in order to provide you with that information or allow you to use it in that way. So what we're really doing is, within this steering committee, we've actually established a playbook. And that playbook has got a number of case studies within it, talking about a number of case studies and how data was captured, why it was captured, and how to make sure that you're ethical in the way that you're managing that data. And the view is that as these use cases or case studies, come about, we can make that information available to a wider audience. So as you're reading through, you can go, oh, I never even thought of that as a particular potential issue in the way we're using data now or in the future. So you can grab some guidance or advice. I'll stop with my monologue now.
Oh, that was really great info. That was super helpful for contextualizing it, what the Red Foundation is kind of working towards and why. So no, I really appreciate that. Like, what are some of the ethical questions, Yusra, the real estate sector kind of needs to still deal with?
I think the first one is, what does ethics mean to us, right? So the first question that we were trying to touch on is this one of consent. Now, when we talk about real estate, in my mind, I straight away go into the fact that there's so many different sectors. So today we talked about retail, but we haven't even touched on residential. One of the most interesting, specifically for me, case studies that we looked at was within residential care homes in particular. It's this conflagration between, I suppose you would say, providing people with freedom, but invading their privacy in order to provide them with that freedom. So take, for example, an aging population, as we know that we are, more people are going to be going into residential care homes. if we were able to incorporate sensors or cameras into units that tracked, monitored them, they were able to identify when an individual needed help before they were able to ask for it. Let's say, for example, they fell and a sensor was able to notice the fact that this individual has had an incident and someone was able to visit. Well, actually, you're giving them some freedom. But where does that line kind of stop? And I think as technology advances and as we're able to offer these types of services and experiences, I think there's always a question of, is that right? How do we make sure that we're protecting consent? But also, how can people change their minds? And I think that's slightly overlooked in a lot of the use cases I'm seeing is you provide your consent in order for your data to be tracked. Should it be captured to begin with? Because do you actually need it in order to provide that service? Second of all, how are you capturing that consent for that service? But also in the same instance, how are you allowing people to opt out? But not an opt out in terms of not providing you with the consent. It's being able to retract that consent once it has been freely given. And I think being able to keep that in mind in everything that we're doing, I think that's a challenge, right? Because there's so many different ways that you could be breaching that in a way without even knowing.
Yeah. And there's also seems to be so many different, forget even the use cases, like the very specific use cases, but different stakeholders, right? You already mentioned you've got owner versus occupier, right? And so what are the different rights? But then you think I think about employer versus employee and how much monitoring in that space that the employer can and should do of their employees. Then you've got the retail organization, I don't want to say versus, but the opposite perspectives here, right? So you've got the retailers of a space, but then you've got the temporary licensees of the public coming in to look around the store and maybe buy some things. And, so on and so forth. You've got services where you might be going in to go to the dentist or doctor and what are they monitoring beyond what you know? So I feel like there's all of these different stakeholders involved in just the tracking, sharing, and taking up space or being in these spaces. Are you coming up with different use cases around ethics and then coming up with standards based on using these different stakeholders? Or, how are you approaching the fact that there are multi-stakeholders involved here?
You're absolutely right. There are a number of different stakeholders. And the issue is as well is that an individual can take up multiple different roles, right? So we're almost always doing musical chairs with these roles because we could be everything at the same time. So what we are trying to do is to look at it from the perspective of different sectors, but also different stakeholders within the sector, and trying to understand, what do they need? And also how they can go about achieving that balance ultimately. I guess the challenge is keeping on top of not only the regulation, which is lacking in a way, or it's I shouldn't say lacking. I think it's developing. But I think the other aspect, which is more of a challenge, is keeping on top of the technology as it evolves. I sort of, tongue in cheek, sort of mentioned how we have this desire to look at new tech and innovate the back of that. But I think as we should absolutely be doing that, first of all, just to make that clear. I think we should be looking at what's coming up, and ChatGPT, I think, is the newest toy in the box. But what we have to be careful of is that as we're leveraging these types of things, is, to your point, to start to look at it from the different perspectives. What are the different ways that people could be leveraging this type of tech, but also providing some steers or guidance that leverages the regulation we do have, but also provides some practical guidance as to what that truly means. And I think that's a really delicate balance. I'll give you another example, but it's really from a city perspective. Very similar to your reward example that you mentioned earlier, but when you're looking at a city that is densely populated, lots of traffic on the road, people are struggling to get from one side to the other. It's really rather an unpleasant experience. And I've experienced a few of those. I won't name them. But there is this ambition to capture, especially location data, people's movements, etc., and be able to redirect them. So on the face of it, that becomes such a wonderful idea, right? So if someone, just as Google Maps redirects you when you're driving, right? Best route here, there. But what if it were to become a little bit, go further? And essentially, if you're looking for a restaurant for the night, it actually tracks the busiest areas and redirects you somewhere else and provides you with rewards for going to somewhere that's a little bit quieter. These are the types of things or experiences that I think we have to start to foresee, capture, and assess for their ethics, essentially. Because on one side, and this is the challenge with ethics, right? Which is why I can't give you a direct answer. The question of ethics is really not, there is no one right answer. I mean, certain things, there is one right answer, right or wrong. But most of the time, it's a question of, on the balance of things, which is the best thing to do, or which is the most sensible thing to do. Is it sensible to give someone a great experience or an easier experience? Yes. But should they be manipulated into going somewhere that they otherwise might not want to go? I don't know, right? It's all about consensus of wider society in terms of what is right or wrong, what the best thing, or what is the common consensus of what we should be doing. And this is why it's so wonderful to be on the steering committee, because we can debate some of these things out and think about things in a slightly different way to what we are potentially programmed to do, or what our instincts would say, right? So yeah, it's fun and it's interesting. I don't think we've captured even a fraction of all of the types of areas or the question marks that we should be looking at. But I think the challenge is always going to be that we're going to need to be keeping up with whatever is happening within the wider world or within industry. Are we using biometrics? Is that the right thing for entry? I mentioned that one before. If you're an employee, what if you don't want to use you don't want your employer to have such a detailed set of data around your facial makeup? Should they be forced to provide you a different mechanism to enter into their building? Or does experience kind of trump that? These are the types of things that we do, is keep on top of what's coming out and then provide some guidance off the back of that on how that could be achieved in a more ethical way.
That's really, really fascinating. And thank you for restating those use cases, or not restating them, but, sharing them with us. That brings up, in my mind, maybe Luke, you could talk a little bit about what it'll take to ensure that real estate companies start leveraging privacy enhancing technologies for data capture and sharing data in a privacy preserving way beyond security controls like biometrics, which makes sense that there might be people who are afraid of giving them. And that's a great conversation that you just had, Yusra, around that tension and how you have to think on balance and think about what your ethics are, and then which is the point of those ethics are to create tension in the org so that you can actually be like, oh, this is important. We have to figure out what our value system is, right? And then the ethics is the approach to getting there, to that value, those set of values, which might differ slightly across depending on who the stakeholder that you are and at what time and at what you think the future should be. But sorry, I started out saying, Luke, I would love to understand your opinion on when the real estate industry will start leveraging PETs.
So just to go back on a couple of things that Yusra's mentioned, and just add one more group into the RED Foundation, which is the Engagement and Awareness Group, which I am the chair. And I have the wonderful job of getting people like Yusra to talk to you like this, which hopefully works very well this evening. But
sorry,
but it's all right. But interestingly, those words, engagement and awareness, I think are crucial in the process of getting the industry, the real estate industry, not to rush into, and I think as Yusra's touched on it, rush into the adoption of what is the newest and shiniest tech, because it might make what is perceived to be the experience of the different stakeholder easier, slicker, quicker. And then there are a whole heap of the additional obligations around that, of course, like we've talked about the case studies and the case law that keeps testing the various different elements of the regulation. And I think it's what we're trying to do. One of the key principles in our driver for next year is to try and take those ethical considerations that Yusra so wonderfully articulated and push those out to the real estate organizations who are looking at adopting, for example, any form of biometrics, facial rec entry into buildings. This has been talked about. I've been part of conversations over the last X number of years, 7 years or so, where this has been brought up on an almost annual basis. Well, can we just put facial rec in? And then, of course, what happens is it goes beyond just the use for access control. Suddenly then it goes into the digital placemaking, making that whole environment and experience better, not only for the employer, but potentially for visitors, potentially for individual occupiers, consumers in the public spaces. And so it's the principles, overlaying the principles of the GDPR, which is, what we still currently operate under in the UK. And that's another totally different subject for another day. And I think it's really educating the real estate industry and like I said, the whole plethora of real estate players on how those ethical considerations need to be taken into account, and then how the privacy enhancing tech can be applied to that, and or just the principles, adopt them properly. Storage limitation, right? If you are going to go down the facial rec route, like you don't need to store the actual recognition picture for longer than half second, nanosecond. It's got to do the recognition, then should be deleted. But these considerations don't get taken into account. It's the speed of access. It's the ease of access. All of those elements are considered first before the actual ethical question of its use, whether it is actually allowed under the regulation or the law in the first place. Because, again, as Yusra has mentioned, there are definitely easier routes to allowing people access to the building. For example, putting a digital pass on their phone. Right? Still don't need the facial rec piece. So what is the recognition piece for, other than to enhance the experience? I think there's a step before the application of the technology, which is the education and awareness piece for the real estate industry. I think we need to engage with them on the ethics questions and then start educating them on the various privacy enhancing tech that is available, which for me is the foundation of building trust with those stakeholders. And that seems to be a word that doesn't get used very often, but is, I think, fundamental to how people engage with those spaces and with the assets.
A couple of years ago, I had the privilege of attending Evanta, which is a Gartner company. They organize events for CDOs. And so this is cross-industry, from television to charities to real estate, all sorts of organizations being represented. And they were all struggling with the same ethics question. So it is by no means, I think, a unique challenge to real estate. I think everyone is capturing more and more data. I think everyone's seeing some massive, huge fines, like hundreds of millions of dollars worth of fines, walking out the front door. And they're saying, well, how do I, as a CDO, make sure I protect my organization from that type of exposure? And so here's where we are.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It makes me think, I just want to bring up, because we've been talking facial recognition, and then, you described a use case where, maybe we'll just use people's faces for them to kind of walk into, on a camera looks at them as they walk into their workplace, right? And it determines whether or not it's you or not. I just want to make the distinction that there is a difference between facial identification. Is this person who claims to be Deborah Farber, right? That's a one-to-one try to match, versus facial recognition, where you're looking at, here's a general population of people are walking in. Who is this person? Oh, we have like a giant database of millions of people. This is Deborah Farber. That's facial recognition. That's different from identification, right? Where you're like it's the authentication of the human, because you already have a facial print somewhere for that employee. In some ways, I think it could be less scary to just walk people through like the technology in an easily consumable way that they can understand and then opt in for. And then I also want to ask, a lot of these things around employees in the UK and Europe is different from the United States. So I'm going to ask real quick if you can maybe talk about the role of works councils in approving some tracking technology within organizations. I think works councils are kind of like unions, but they operate a little differently on your side of the pond. Are you able to enlighten us there, what that process is like? And
to be honest, I think works councils are a lot more stringent on the continent. So the likes of Germany, Switzerland, my interactions in the past, or where I've my sphere has crossed past them in Europe, they've been a lot more challenging. I think in the UK, where you have unions, not every type of job, I think, is unionized. I think they tend to be much more for
public services, definitely.
Public
services definitely are very union heavy in the UK, at least.
Okay.
So it really, again, it depends on which part of the sector that we're talking about. If you're talking about things like logistics, for example, if you're moving more into the construction type of space, I think that's where you start to encounter some of those, making sure that you engage with the works councils or the unions, as we call them here, and describing your need, and also articulating the impact specifically that is going to, whatever it is that you're trying to achieve is going to have on employees or the individuals in question. As you get more into when you move further, I think, into the occupier side of the fence, a lot of the focus tends to be on more of the white collar, I suppose, type of services. And I think it becomes a much more equal balance of individuals. And so you probably don't encounter the unions as much as you would otherwise.
That's helpful. Thank you. I really just didn't have as much insight into Europe generally when it came to unions and works councils. So that actually helps shed some light that you refer to them as unions even in the UK, like we do here, and that they might operate slightly differently from the rest of the continent. So I learned something. Thank you. I learned many things, but thank you for that. So Luke, we're talking here a lot about the industry general and how approaches are required to kind of gather the stakeholders and let them understand, educate them and their communities on all of this data collection and, how to balance with the right controls to preserve privacy, whether it's through PETs or security controls or architecture and just different ways of thinking. Well, since this is a show aimed at privacy engineers, I'm curious if you have guidance for them as to, are there opportunities basically for privacy engineers to work in the real estate sector? Obviously, you can't have privacy enhancing technologies deployed appropriately without experts in that field who understand the space and appropriate ways of deployment and what's worked for others in the past, and maybe taking a look at research and, all of that, right? So is there appetite right now for privacy engineers to be hired into real estate companies or even occupiers of that space's overall approach to privacy in their space?
I've definitely got appetite for it, if that helps. Right. So I think there is a huge need for privacy engineers in the real estate space. I think we are, and again, back to the reason the Red Foundation was set up and founded, was the perception from the people who were a part of that organization that the real estate industry is behind other sectors in understanding both how to leverage the data correctly, process the data in an ethical and secure way. And then, of course, then the next layer on is, well, how do we make sure that we protect the privacy and data elements for the various stakeholders that are involved? Because, as we mentioned earlier, we capture quite a lot of personal data, but the rush to just adopt technology to enhance experience is, in my opinion, a huge opportunity for real estate companies to take on board privacy engineers, listen to their input in conjunction with those who are talking through the ethical questions about some of the processes that some of the real estate companies want to take on board and are implementing, and to really drive the enhancement of the technology that is ultimately going to build that trust with the real estate companies, the housing associations, the residential developers, all of those different stakeholders are ultimately trying to build a product that is trusted by their potential purchasers and or occupiers. But the tech at the moment isn't supporting, in my opinion, the privacy enhancing elements sufficiently. So I think there is a huge opportunity there to try and bring privacy enhancing tech and engineering into this space. I, for one, am desperate to take on a privacy engineer in a slightly different field to real estate, because I still think I've got the same challenges in a different field. And I know that's for another podcast, but I think there is huge opportunity for the privacy engineering space in the sector.
That's great to hear. I don't see too many roles, at least stateside, for retail hiring. Well, maybe not just retail, but like, let's say the real estate industry in general, hiring. I really do hope to see more of that. I am curious, though, compared to other industries, I guess the assumption would be that there's not that much software in the real estate industry, but that's probably not true these days. I even look at something like WeWork, working, to visit somebody that's there, or I even for a short time had like a small office in one of them. Even then, while you wouldn't think software was a big part of their value prop, there was this WeWork website app thing that you could all connect to, and kind of almost a little bit of a local social networking thing for those who are WeWorkers, and also guidance of their different properties and things. So there was some software involved. And I remember this was years ago. So I was poking around going, they could improve here. But I'm wondering, is privacy by design and engineering generally, like baking into the software development lifecycle, something that's important to the real estate industry, or is it more around privacy enhancing technologies and deploying that across their analytics stack? Like, just give us a little sense of that, if you could, for software developers.
So that particular type of application and or engagement is definitely becoming more prominent. So I'm conscious of a number of developers who are running their own apps to enhance the community, basically, of occupiers and themselves in the different spaces that they've got, trying to bring in consumers to the retail elements of the different spaces, and trying to bring that all under one hood of a particular app that's relevant to that particular space. I'm obviously trying desperately to avoid names, but and so I think you've got two tiers, really. The first one is definitely trying to drive the development of the technology, but to try and take into account the prevailing data protection laws. Okay, so we're looking at it from a high-level data protection perspective, and what will allow a risk-based level of compliance to be gathered before deployment of said technology. That lower layer, that more base layer for me, the privacy by design element and the introduction of the privacy enhancing tech, I think is still very much in its infancy, because it feels like we're still in a retrospective, retroactive, reactive scenario in order to try and bake that in, which Yusra and I have had numerous conversations recently on the ESG thing we mentioned earlier, where we're trying to make what look like small changes further down the line actually result in huge cost, huge time consumption, and actually then the ROI of that change suddenly doesn't get baked into the ROI of the actual end product. And so it becomes, let's not do the privacy enhancing tech bit. Are we as compliant with the law as we can be with the tech stack as it currently stands? Yes, we are. Then we're good to go. I think there is, as I've said, the opportunity for privacy enhancing tech in conjunction with a deeper understanding of and need to embed privacy by design from the start of the development of these kind of applications, where you're bringing community together, you're bringing occupiers together, you're bringing the space utilization under one banner, I think is in its infancy.
Great. Well, it sounds like a lot of opportunity. I would love, as we close today, if you could tell us how people could get involved with the RED Foundation. Are there any resources that you'd like to point them to? How can they collaborate?
Yeah, so we are on LinkedIn, so we will drop that information. We're also got a website, so we can pop that across as well, and that can go into the show notes.
Yep.
And obviously, Yusra and I are more than happy to get contact from anybody via LinkedIn and talk to anybody about getting involved in real estate and tech.
Excellent. Well, I'll definitely put that information in the show notes. Yusra, Luke, any last words of wisdom before we close today to, share with the audience?
That's definitely up to you, Yusra.
Words of wisdom. There's so many things, right? I think that there is, and following on from your conversation just now around opportunity, there is huge amounts of opportunity where it relates to data, where it relates to real estate tech, the prop tech sector and cre-tech sector, whichever way you want to call it. It's growing year on year, and it's significantly sizable. And with that, there's implications, there's challenges. I think if we bring it down to the most basic viewpoint, the more that you start to digitize your property, the greater risk that you open yourself up to from someone, a hacker somewhere logging in or breaking in virtually into your space and creating some real world damage potentially. So from a privacy perspective, I think there's definitely opportunity there. But what I also think is that we shouldn't allow that to deter us from innovating and progressing, right? Because these are obstacles rather than blockers. So we just need to find a way to jump over them. And there's smart enough people to be able to do that and create some new exciting experiences for us, I would say. So come with plenty of ideas and an open mind. And there's a lot of stuff that we can be doing here, a lot of things we can solve for.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. And start seeing privacy and privacy enhancing tech and privacy by design, not as a blocker. It's a great way to finish, not as a blocker, but as a builder for actually doing the right thing, building the right tech, and providing the right experience and building the customer trust.
Yeah, to me, it sounds like we really need to threat model for both privacy and security, prevent the criminal hackers. I say this, my fiance is a hacker, an ethical hacker, does it for a living. So, I'm always want to mention that these, we should say criminal hackers, not just hackers as if they all are criminals. Have the right controls. If you're doing your threat modeling, you're figuring out those use cases, not just for security, but threat model for privacy as well, where you could, uncover what in your environment, the potential harms that the use cases would have to people as well as to your assets. Continue doing that to uncover what the potential threats are, because they're going to constantly be evolving and changing. So it's not a one and done compliance thing. It's an ongoing, part of managing your tech stack today. And that if you build it in privacy and by design, you'll be more proactive, you'll be more agile when you go to market, you're building privacy into your MVP. You're not waiting till later to figure out with all, now that you have all this technical debt, how you're going to have to redo things and re-architect things. Someone I respect very much in the AI space, Ruman Chowdhury, who's in the ethical AI space, and I've known for a long time, talks about that adding brakes to one's car. Yeah, it's for safety, but it gives the user trust in your overall system. So you end up driving faster when you have brakes and have these guardrails built in, and safety around the car actually doesn't slow you down. It makes you faster. And I feel the same way about privacy by design or even ethical AI. You build this stuff in from the beginning. It's now market ready to be consumed by those who do care about safety and privacy and security and humans and, not just users and nameless analytic stats, right? Like the protections are real, and the entire economy and the companies that might be more visible and might more likely get fined and have, the different regulatory body is concerned about what they're doing. They're going to be very careful about their downstream, the companies they work with, the technologies they work with. So if you want to sell to larger organizations that know they have regulatory scrutiny on them, you'll get through the sales process faster if you proactively have been thinking about privacy rather than coming to market with a product or service in the real estate space and then expecting that it's just going to be consumed and then finding out you have to fix all these things, right? So again, it's all about increasing ROI. Privacy is not a blocker if you actually think about it early and embed it into design, architecture, and software development and DevOps. So thank you, Luke and Yusra. Thank you so much for joining us on the Shifting Privacy Left podcast. Until next Tuesday, everyone, when we'll be back with engaging content and another great guest or guests. Thanks for joining us this week on Shifting Privacy Left. Make sure to visit our website, shiftingprivacyleft.com, where you can subscribe to updates so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found this episode valuable, go ahead and share it with a friend. And if you're an engineer who cares passionately about privacy, check out Privado, the developer-friendly privacy platform and sponsor of this show. To learn more, go to privado.ai. Be sure to tune in next Tuesday for a new episode. Bye for now.